You know, the economy right now feels kind of confusing, doesn't it? On one hand, we hear all this talk about strength and stability, but on the other, a lot of us feel this growing anxiety. Well, according to our source material, that's because the official story and what's really happening might be two completely different things. So let's dive in and unpack it. One of our sources really puts a fine point on it with this quote. Right now, millions of Americans are quietly losing their jobs, the people who did everything right. Wow, I mean, that really gets to the heart of the tension we're talking about today, right? That growing gap between the official numbers and what people are actually living through. So, the official story is pretty simple. We've all heard it. It goes something like this. The government workforce is stable, hasn't really grown in decades, and the overall job market is healthy and chugging along, adding new jobs. These are the headlines we see, the data points we hear on the news. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the way those numbers are presented is actually hiding something much bigger and honestly a lot more disruptive? It's time to peel back a few layers. Okay, first up, let's talk about the size of government. The official story says the federal workforce is stable, but our sources say there's this massive hidden workforce. And when you really start counting, well, you get a completely different picture. So this is the number you almost always hear, about 3 million official federal employees. And look, it's true. That specific number has been incredibly stable for decades. It seems kind of manageable, right? Not too alarming? But hold on, the source material makes a powerful argument. They say if you define a government worker as anyone whose paycheck is ultimately funded by our tax dollars, the number isn't 3 million, it's over 11 million. So where in the world do these other 8 million people come from? This chart is how we get to that 11.3 million. The sources argue that we have to look way beyond the 2 million civil service employees. We also need to count the millions and millions of contractors and all the people who get grant money. Their paychecks are funded by tax dollars too. When you add it all up, the direct government workforce is just a tiny slice of the pie. But the funding source for all of them, it's the same. It's you. So we have one set of numbers, government employment, that's way bigger than it seems. Now let's flip to another set of numbers, job growth, that the sources say is actually much, much weaker than it's been reported. And they argue these two things are connected. A huge government-funded workforce might just be masking a really weak private sector. Okay, take a look at these numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS. Now, they regularly revise their first job estimates as more data comes in. That's normal. But what the sources are pointing out is that the recent downward revisions have been just staggering. Between 2024 and 2025, nearly a million jobs that were first reported, they just vanished from the data after the revisions. The sources actually call these phantom jobs. And this chart really puts that into perspective. A healthy month for the U.S. economy, that used to mean adding about 150,000 jobs. But after all those revisions, the average for 2025 was just 15,000. The sources call these recession-level numbers. I mean, that's a full 10 times weaker than what we consider a normal, healthy month. So let's recap. We've got a government that's much bigger than it looks, and job growth that's much weaker than reported. Our sources argue this isn't just a bump in the road or a bad economic cycle. They say it's part of a much bigger, historical pattern they call the Great Substitution. And here is the single most important point from the source material. This isn't a temporary downturn. It's a permanent substitution. That cognitive, white-collar work, the very jobs that built the modern middle class, isn't just on hold waiting for things to get better. It's actively being replaced by technology, and specifically by AI. To really get this, we have to look back at history. Economists actually have a name for this kind of thing, Engel's pause. It describes a period, think the Industrial Revolution, where brand new technology makes the overall economy a lot richer. But for decades, the actual wages and living standards for everyday people, they either stay flat or they actually go down. And this pattern isn't some one-off thing. The sources show this has happened with every major tech revolution. After the Industrial Revolution, it took 60 to 80 years for the benefits to be widely shared. With electrification, it was 40 to 60 years. And think about it, we're over 30 years into the internet age, and the vast majority of the gains are still super concentrated at the very top. This brings us to something called the Luddite fallacy. That's the idea that technology always creates more jobs than it kills. The sources say, yeah, this is true, eventually. But here's the catch. Eventually can mean 40, 60, or even 80 years. And for the generation of people who have to live through that transition, whose skills are suddenly obsolete, the economic devastation is very, very real. And the argument this time is that AI is actually substituting for our brains, for cognitive work, which is a whole different ballgame. Okay, so if this huge once-in-a-generation shift is really happening, what are we supposed to do about it? The last part of our explainer tonight focuses on the framework the sources propose for how to actually navigate this new economic reality. According to the sources, getting through this really requires a massive shift in mindset. The old employee mindset, save money from a stable salary and just wait for things to get back to normal, is now a losing strategy. The alternative they propose is an owner mindset. This is all about building, about investing in assets, and adapting to the fact that this change is permanent. And this all comes together in a 5-step guide from the source material. First, own assets. Get your cash into a diversified portfolio. Second, hold enough liquid cash, like 6 to 12 months of expenses, so you're never forced to sell those assets when the market's down. Third, master AI. Learn to use these tools professionally to multiply your own productivity. Fourth, think like an entrepreneur. The barriers to starting a business are collapsing. And finally, stay flexible. Preserve your ability to absorb shocks and, more importantly, to jump on new opportunities as they pop up. So, all of this leaves us with one really critical question. History shows us that these huge transformations, while definitely painful, do create incredible wealth and opportunity. The challenge and the real question this whole explainer leaves us with is pretty simple. This time around, who is all that opportunity going to be for?